Thank you for joining this last session of the two-day conference on poverty and social justice in a post-COVID world. Yesterday we had an in-person day of presentations in Bristol, which was largely concentrated on the situation in the United Kingdom. And today we have had speakers from around the world. So first thing this morning, we had speakers from Oceania and from Asia. And then we had four very excellent speech talks from researchers in Europe. We have just completed a session on poverty and COVID-19 in Africa, which was very diverse and very interesting. And this is our final session on poverty and COVID in the Americas, with speakers both from North and South America. I'm the uh, director of the Bristol Poverty Institute, David Gordon, and I'm starting chairing with this session. But before I go on, I'm going to hand you over to the co-chair, Joe Jazwiski, who's going to give you an introduction to the Bristol Poverty Institute. I apologize for people who've been to the previous sessions and heard it before, but we need to repeat it because some people are joining for the first time. Joe?
Thank you, Dave. That's great. And yeah, just to let everyone know, we've had a few technical difficulties, which is why Camilla Morelli hasn't started off this afternoon, but she will hopefully join and take over the chairing after I've done my bit.
Sorry. Hi. Hello, everyone, and apologies for the technical issues, but I'm here now.
She's here now. Great. All right,
Great,
Camilla.
thanks. I'll give up.
Yeah, I'll hand back to you after my piece then. So just to kick us off then, I'd like to welcome you all who have joined us for this session, which is of course part of our two-day conference on poverty and social justice in a post-COVID world. My name is Joe Jazwiski, and I work as the Development Associate for the Bristol Poverty Institute to help forward the initiatives of the Institute and co-create our events and activities, such as this fantastic event we've held over the past 2 days. So to give you a bit of background on what we do at the Bristol Poverty Institute, or the BPI for short, the BPI was launched in 2017, and we are an interdisciplinary research institute whose role is to grow, develop and promote the poverty and poverty-relevant research community at the University of Bristol and beyond, engaging across sectors to work together towards ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. This is driven by our mission to explore the interface of different social, political, and environmental dimensions of poverty, with the ultimate aim of translating our research on the causes, effects, and measurement of poverty into evidence-informed policy and practice, which drives forward social justice. And to recap and introduce our conference again, even though this is our last and closing session of our wonderful two-day conference. So this was a two-day hybrid event balancing the benefits of in-person engagement with the accessibility of online events. Our aim was to bring together a broad multi-sector audience to explore how the pandemic has affected and impacted on different dimensions of poverty. The pandemic wreaked havoc across the world, disrupting all of our lives. New inequalities emerged and existing inequalities were exposed and exacerbated. Many of these persisted long beyond the peak of the pandemic. Whilst the title of our event talks about a post-COVID world, this is with recognition that COVID is very much still here, affecting our lives and resulting in premature deaths. The focus of the conference is therefore on dimensions of poverty in today's world, a world which has been shaped and impacted by the pandemic in various ways. We therefore need to explore and understand all of the ways that the pandemic has impacted on our societies and what needs to be done to mitigate and navigate impacts and harness the opportunities. And that is why we are here today. And we had two sessions earlier today. And as I said, this is our last one, so we're very excited to welcome our final speakers. But before I hand back to Camilla, one final point is we have British Sign Language interpreters here with us today. So that's Nicole and Paul. And our recommendation, because unfortunately the interpreter button is not working in Zoom when we tested it the other day. So in order for you to see the sign language, please find Nicole and Paul and pin their video feeds so that you can see them consistently throughout the presentations. So thank you. And now I will hand back to Camilla. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Joe. So, and again, apologies for being late due to some technical issues. So, my name is Camilla Morelli, and I am a senior lecturer in social anthropology at Bristol. And it is my absolute pleasure to be chairing today's session on poverty and the impacts of COVID-19 in the Americas. Now, before we start, I will very briefly introduce myself. So I am a social anthropologist, and I specialize in research with children and young people in Latin America. I have done most of my research in the Amazonian region, working with children and migrant youth who are moving from forest and rural communities to urban centers. And the young people I work with are facing really precarious futures that have been made even more precarious, like Joe was saying, by the impact of the pandemic. And well, what I do is that I use visual and co-produced methods to work with children and young people who are dealing with extreme poverty, economic hardship, and precarious futures, and to help them find a way to tell their stories, amplify their voices, but also think strategically about pathways to establish better sustainable futures for themselves and for their communities. And I am really, really eager to hear about the research of the fantastic speakers that we have in today's sessions. But first of all, Joe, if I am correct, I have a few words of housekeeping. Again, I missed the first minute here, so I'm not sure if you've done this already.
No, I didn't do that. So please go
Okay.
ahead if you're okay to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely, I will go ahead. So first of all, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube platform and embedded in Bristol Poverty Institute website. So just to let you know that by attending, you are consenting to being part of this recording. So please ensure that you have added your name rather than being listed as guest, because the BPI team will be monitoring attendees. And of course, we need to know who is asking questions to our speakers. And you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we have time constraints, of course, so maybe we are not able to answer all of the questions, but you're very welcome to get in touch with the speakers afterwards to continue the conversation. And again, please note that the chat function is not available to attendees, so please use the Q&A function. And finally, we are going to ask you to please be respectful because all events, these conferences are and have been monitored, and we reserve the right to remove any attendee whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. So I think we've heard from our co-host already. So I am just going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Héctor Nájera, who is talking on behalf of Professor Fernando Cortés. And they're going to talk about poverty during the COVID-19 pandemic, findings from new data. So Dr. Héctor Nájera completed his PhD and a one-year postdoctoral fellowship here at the University of Bristol. So I will just hand over to them and we can start.
Hi, my name is Héctor Nájera, and I am presenting on behalf of Professor Fernando Cortés. We apologize because we couldn't do a live presentation and we would like to thank the Bristol Poverty Institute for their kind invitation to present these research findings of the behavior of poverty during the pandemic using some recently released data that allow us to see better the short-term impacts of the pandemic on poverty. The following results are going to make sense after we consider some of the basic definitions of the official definition of poverty in Mexico. Poverty is measured using a multidimensional index that combines income and material deprivation. As you can see, multidimensionally poor are those with an income below the overall poverty line and with a deprivation score of 1 plus deprivations out of 6 deprivations. Then we have another category, which are the extremely poor. They have an income below the food poverty line and with a deprivation score of 3 plus deprivations. Since 2008, poverty is computed using the ENIC survey, which is undertaken every 2 years, and the latest version corresponds to 2022, which was released last year. However, we have some new data, which are called the ENIC-F. These data were collected just before the pandemic started. It is important to note that the first lockdown in Mexico took place in April 2020. So with this survey, we can assess what was the status of poverty just before the pandemic, because this data corresponds to the first quarter of 2020. And well, both surveys, they have small differences in the sample size, but overall the design is the same. So they both produce comparable estimates. So multidimensional poverty has not fluctuated a lot since the official measurements that started in 2008. We are just going to focus on the most recent years for simplicity, but multidimensional poverty prior the pandemic had fluctuated around 43%. So in 2016 was 43%, in 2018 was 42%, and when the results for 2020 were released, we were a bit surprised because poverty only increased by 2 percentage points. And then we were surprised again because with the latest version, poverty dropped by 7 percentage points in a context of high inflation and moderate economic. And then when we look at extreme poverty, we barely see any important changes in the behavior of extreme poverty. However, we can see that it does not follow the same trend as multidimensional poverty. But in any case, this 2018 to 2020 data suggests that the effects of the pandemic were rather minor in Mexico. However, what happens when the new data is included in the analysis? Well, the picture changes dramatically. This is the series that we saw before. And when we include the new data, we see that just before the pandemic, poverty had already had a major reduction from 42 to 37%. So with this new data, we have a better idea. Poverty had a substantive short-term increase in 2020, 7 percentage points. It is important to note, however, that extreme poverty didn't follow the same trend. The sharp decline is not observed in 2022, and the levels of extreme poverty are the same as in 2016. So one of the first questions is why we observe these short-term patterns and the mid-term patterns, and why these changes did not occur for the less, these changes occur, sorry, for the least poor. And well, one of the first things that we notice is that the behavior of multidimensional poverty in recent years, which actually can be a critique to the official index, but we cannot talk about this today. The changes in multidimensional poverty have been dictated by income poverty. If we plot the trends for income poverty, we see that it follows, it mirrors the trend of multidimensional poverty. And when we look at extreme income poverty, we see a similar pattern compared with extreme multidimensional poverty. So again, we have the same pattern as before. However, when we look at material deprivation, we see a contrast, because material deprivation does not fluctuate as dramatically compared with income poverty. And we see that the poorest of the poor, if anything, they have been left out of the progress that the country has made with regard to poverty reduction. We know that the dynamics of income poverty and material deprivation are different in the short term, but even after a couple of years, the series have started to look a little bit disassociated. So in order to understand the short-term effects of the pandemic, as well as the overall changes in poverty in Mexico, it's key to look at the drivers of income poverty. So what are the main drivers of income poverty? Well, we can think about this problem as a decomposition problem, where we would like to assess the extent to which the changes in poverty are attributable to other sources, like changes in income, changes in the distribution of income, and price variations. And there is a rather famous decomposition, which is called the Dagrovalian decomposition, which is a rather simple way to assess and to have a better idea of the main drivers of income poverty by looking at these three factors: increases in income, redistribution effects of income, and changes in prices. So the table that we are going to show shows the result of this decomposition. And what we found is that between 2018 and the first quarter of 2020, income growth and the progressive redistribution of income drove poverty reduction. So we see that it's not only that income increased, but there is also a presence of a important effect of redistribution of income. So the increase in monetary poverty and in the months of COVID was caused by the fall of income, which in turn is the most important factor in the return to the pre-pandemic situation. So if we take, for example, 2018 and 2020, the first quarter, we see that the decrease in poverty is mainly driven by these two factors, income and redistribution. The effects of prices are actually small, 1 percentage point, even if we have a high inflation in Mexico. And well, the question is, how did Mexico manage to have such a high redistribution effect in a period of low economic growth, high inflation, and during a supply side shock like the COVID-19 pandemic? And there have been three explanations, three hypotheses of why this has happened. One explanation is the increase in minimum wages that started in 2016, the new scheme of cash transfer, which moved to from a targeted scheme toward a universal system. And the third explanation is about the behavior of the remittances, which are rather important in Mexico, especially remittances from the US, from Mexicans that live in the US. However, when you look at the table on the right-hand side, you can see that the salaries remuneration for work plays a major role in the incomes of the Mexican populations. Around 70% of the income comes from this source. And remittances and cash transfers are actually, and they have played a small role in the income of the population, and therefore they also have played a rather small role in poverty reduction. Actually, other transfers, which are mainly pensions and the increase of minimum wages, seem to be the main drivers of this high redistribution effect that we have observed in the latest rounds of the NH survey. If redistribution has been one of the main drivers of poverty reduction in the short term, it is important to know the sources. And if we decompose the Gini coefficient, because we are looking at redistribution, we see that labor income has been the main driver of poverty reduction, thanks to the changes in the minimum salary that we have experienced in 2016. There is, however, there are some concerns about the extent to which the minimum salaries could continue to increase even further, given that the Mexican economy is not performing very well, which is why the extent of this redistribution effect remains to be seen for the long term. How sustainable this is going to be is one of the questions that we have. So what are the main conclusions of this analysis? Is that the COVID-19 pandemic had a bigger short-term impact than previously documented on multidimensional poverty. Reduced between 2018 and the first quarter of 2020, thanks to these changes to the minimum salary levels. And the poverty levels in 2022 are simply a return to the values observed during the first quarter of 2020. The economic shock caused by the pandemic raised all poverty measurements, and 2 years later, Mexico has returned to the initial situation in 2020. The observed changes in the prevalence of multidimensional poverty depend fundamentally on the changes of income and to lesser extent on those that occur in the domain of social rights, which is material deprivation, basically. This story, however, is different for the poorest of the poor, and very little progress has been made in this regard in Mexico. The impact of redistribution by minimum wages, for example, seems to be much more modest in this population group. The evidence also suggests that this group is more likely to lack access to health services according to the official index. And there is also some evidence about the relationship between income and the likelihood of death due to COVID, and the poorest of the poor seem to have a higher likelihood, for example. And also, it is noteworthy that the sharp fall in income poverty recorded between 2018 and 2020, the first quarter, was due to a combination of the increase of income with a reduction in inequality. And the main source of income that brought down poverty were salaries. And again, cash transfers and remittances play a meager role. Behind this increase in income that brought down poverty between 2018 and 2020, the first quarter, is the rise in wages in general. And well, we need to study more about the effect of minimum wages, the changes to the scheme of minimum wages, the level of the minimum wages that started in 2016. The recovery of labor income in 2022 after the pandemic is consistent with this rise in minimum wages. However, the relationship between minimum wage and per capita household income is not direct nor simple, mainly because we have a large informal sector, and how these changes in minimum wages translate to the informal sector need to be studied further. And one of the problems is that also labor income is also the main source of income inequality in Mexico. And well, one of the final aspects that is important to bear in mind when looking at these findings is that the multidimensional measurement of poverty in Mexico has, in accordance with the legislation, a focus on social rights that are recognized, acknowledged in the Mexican Constitution. However, this analysis have shown that the social deprivation has had a limited effect on changes in poverty prevalence. So while we are seeing an improvement in the income domain of the poverty measurement, we are not seeing the same kind of results when we look at material deprivation. This is all that we have. Thank you very much for paying attention to this presentation. We are not able to answer your questions right now, but if you want, you can send us an email and we will be happy to share the results. These are the results from a larger study. Thanks. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.
Okay, and back to you, Camilla.
Yes, that was such a great talk to start with. So I think because, of course, we'll keep all the questions for the end, but please do write down the emails of the first two speakers so you can get in touch with them if you have any questions for them directly. But now we will move on to the second speaker who is attending here the session, who is Dr. Flávia Uchôa. Flávia is a social psychologist and an assistant professor at the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And she specializes in precarious work and its societal impacts, focusing particularly on developing measures to tackle multidimensional poverty. And Flávia has pioneered the use of consensual approach in Brazil. So thank you very much, Flávia, for joining us today. And I will just leave it to you now.
Hi everyone, I'm Flávia Uchôa de Oliveira. I'm a lecturer at Universidade Federal Fluminense. I'm really excited to share some insights with you all from our research in Brazil. I'd like to thank Professor Shoilan for all his support and also my colleagues at Unicamp, which is the State University of Campinas. Today I would like to share with you all our journey on implementing the recommendations from the Compendium of Best Practices in Poverty Measurements by the Rio Group almost 2 decades ago. They highlighted that we need to go beyond income to measure poverty. And there, in the introduction, Professor Townsend reminded us that poverty line cannot be based on an arbitrary selection of a low level of income, but only scientific criteria independent of income can justify where the poverty line should be drawn. So in that sense, and our project aims to advance the task that Townsend set out, initiated back in 2018 through a cooperation agreement between Cardiff University and Unicamp. The research project named Multidimensional Poverty in Brazil aims to create a scientifically valid and reliable multidimensional measure in our country. In 2019, we launched the project with focus groups in the city of Campinas, the state of São Paulo, southern of Brazil. But as we all know, we all had our lives impacted by the pandemic, and the scenario forced us to adapt our research. But I must emphasize that our scenario in Brazil was critical. During the pandemic, our country became part of a worldwide experiment based on the false thesis of the herd immunity through transmission. This resulted in over 700,000 deaths and millions of cases of COVID-19. Well, despite all these challenges, despite all this horrendous scenario, and because of these challenges, we collaborated with the Public Labor Prosecution Service to pilot our survey in impoverished communities in São Paulo City, which included 3 communities, Brasilândia, Paraisópolis, and Vila Vietnã. Participants in these communities were asked, actually they were presented a list of items and asked whether each item of that list was or could be considered as a necessity for a decent living standard in our country. We also inquired respondents whether they had access to that item or if they lacked it. Our goal was to assess the consensus on the necessities of life in Brazil while identifying the level of deprivation across different groups in society. There were about 180 respondents across these 3 communities. So you can learn a bit about these communities. Brasilândia is actually a district in São Paulo City with 90 favelas in the northern São Paulo. It is home for over 206,000 residents. It was severely impacted by COVID-19. Actually, the community had the highest mortality rates during the first months of the health crisis at the city level. So, the second community surveyed was Paraisópolis, which is one of the oldest and largest favelas in São Paulo. It is located in the south of the city, and it has nearly 100,000 residents, and it's 100 years old, a little bit more, maybe 104 years old. This community was really renowned, became renowned during the pandemic for its effective community actions on the ground. And that resulted Paraisópolis to keep mortality rates lower than the city average. I know that you can see the photo. It's a really famous photo. It represents the image of Brazil's inequalities. And this photo is a photo by Tuca Vieira that was used as a poster for the Global Cities exhibition back in the mid-2000s in Tate Modern in London. So you might recognize this photo also. Well, the third community surveyed was Vila Vietnã. Vila Vietnã with about 3,000 residents. It is located in a high real estate speculation area in São Paulo. It's southern of São Paulo also. It faces significant challenges, including drug trafficking. And as you can see, all 3 communities face poor housing, with overcrowding, poor electricity, and poor sanitation conditions. But they took the lead during the pandemic. They responded with a strong solidarity during the pandemic. They created a solidarity network through their residents' union. So, the pilot survey revealed high levels of consensus across the 3 communities. As you may note, personal hygiene products had the highest consensus, with 99% of respondents agreeing it was a necessity of life back in the pandemic. Additionally, as you can see, 96% of respondents considered sending children to school and to daycare. also a necessity of life, likely reflecting the impact of the pandemic and the forced homeschooling during the health crisis. So this second heat map, it shows the deprivation among the three communities, but also the difference between genders and also the differences between individuals considered disadvantaged or more economically disadvantaged across the three communities. As you can see, Vila Vietnã has the highest levels and experienced high levels of deprivation among the three communities. And we also highlight the high deprivations among women and those individuals classified as more economically disadvantaged across the three communities. So food insecurity was also a major issue, with Vila Vietnã respondents reporting 94% of them being unable to afford daily meat and vegetables. So our findings also point to the deprivation by work status, and it's interesting to see that informal and unemployed individuals have the highest levels of deprivation, highlighting the importance of social protection during that time. It's also interesting to note the range of deprivation among self-employed. So from these pilot studies in these three communities, we decided to extend our research to a representative sample of the city of São Paulo, interviewing 2,300 individuals in their households. This allowed us to examine the level of consensus and identify the groups with higher levels of deprivation in the wealthiest city of our country. So, to present the primary findings of the São Paulo survey, I would like first to focus on the deprivation levels across education and across regions in the city, and then on the consensus and deprivation regarding children's items. So, when examining the level of deprivation by years of education in São Paulo, you may see in the chart that is noticeable and that few years of education correlate with higher levels of deprivation, and conversely, higher education seems to be associated with no deprivation or fewer deprivations. Note that the items here are categorized by age and also by those applicable to all households residents despite the age. So, moving on to the levels of deprivation across the city, we can see that we divided São Paulo in 5 regions, and the outskirts of the city experienced high deprivation back in 2021. As you may note on the table, that the north region was especially deprived of children's items. And as you can see here, we also categorized the items by age and also those applicable to all households residents. This kind of mapping intra-urban inequalities could be especially valuable for in a normal city like São Paulo to the public policy in the district level. I also want you to pay attention on the regions that are highlighted in red. as you can see, are the outskirts, the periphery of the city. So the far east, south, and north regions, they stand out as the regions that were facing the highest levels of deprivation, the northern region in particularly. So focusing now on children's living standards, we observed that the education-related items had the highest consensus, especially in the North region, which is also facing or faced the highest deprivation levels. It is interesting to see that maybe for those who critically examining the concept of adaptive preference, in the ones studying this concept may be interesting in this data, because this result could be instrumental to challenge the concept of adaptive preference and its application in public policy. For instance, in São Paulo, there was no evidence of adaptive preferences as a bias when employing the consensual approach. So, the heat map that we show now reviews the deprivation from children's items, and there were elevated levels of deprivation, especially concerning education-related items. The North and the Far East region also stand out with the highest levels of deprivation and the greatest number of items from which children are deprived. This table here is an effort to relate low income and low standard of living. We grouped households with children across São Paulo to identify those that were more or less vulnerable according to the household monthly income and also the number of deprivations experienced in that household. So we used the monthly income threshold of 2,200 reais, which was the average income in Brazil in 2021. So that year in São Paulo, 29% of households with children were considered poor, which translates to approximately 700,000 children living in poverty and other 600,000 that were vulnerable. So these keys, the key findings or the main findings in São Paulo point to a high level of consensus across the city and across different groups in society, in the society of São Paulo. Out of the 31 items evaluated, only one was not perceived as a necessity, which was subscription TV. These results point to more pronounced deprivations among the unemployed, those engaged in occasional work, households with children, households with low income, and individuals with fewer years of schooling. Food insecurity is likely a pronounced issue, with 43% of respondents reported being deprived of daily meat consumption. So we emphasize these results because they resonate with the increase in unemployment during the pandemic, although it was a trend, or it has been a trend since 2017 after the labor laws reform. The pandemic for sure exacerbated the unemployment rates. And these results in São Paulo likely reflect the extent of food insecurity experienced by Brazilians. After a decade, as some of you may know, the UN placed Brazil back on the hunger map, citing a staggering number of 33 million Brazilians experience food insecurity. So implementing the consensual approach in the biggest and wealthiest city in our country for sure advanced our understanding of multidimensional poverty in Latin America, for sure. While São Paulo can be compared and easily compared to cities like Bogota and Buenos Aires, it stands unique in Brazil. It's not representative of the majority of the municipalities in our country. So, because of that, our efforts shifted towards extending the project to other cities and other regions in Brazil that were more representative at the national level, like Botuporã, which is a small municipality in the south of Bahia, which is a state in the northeast of Brazil, the poorest region of our country. And there we conducted 7 focus groups and over 1,100 interviews with significant support from the City Hall and also from the Rural Workers Union. So, the population of Botuporã, just for you to learn a bit about this municipality, is around 11,000 people, with most residents living in rural areas. The municipality lacks public transportation system. It has limited school and health facilities, which are only available in the city center. And back in 2021, the average monthly income in Botuporã was close to 2 minimum wages, approximately 2,600 reais. So our qualitative analysis in Botuporã shows that poverty is seen as a multidimensional phenomenon, affecting housing, food, healthcare, and leisure. As Jay, a 44-year-old black male rural worker, expressed, being poor in Brazil means being deprived of these essential things for survival and quality of life. There is also support for universal basic income, as MF, a 53-year-old woman healthcare worker, emphasized every family should have a salary to live with dignity. So far, and to conclude and to sum up, our analysis points to a general understanding that poverty is not just low income, but something experienced on many fronts, like Thousand demonstrated in his work in the UK. Our ongoing work in Campinas metropolitan region will expand our database in the southeast of Brazil. In the near future, we hope to include new municipalities and other regions of the country, aiming for a national survey and hopefully the creation of a multidimensional poverty atlas in Brazil. For further reading, here are some of our publications in Portuguese about the methodology and the discussions that we have been engaged in over the last 6 years. I thank you for your attention, and I will be available for questions and any further discussions. You can contact us to learn more about our project at the poverty@unicamp.br. And thank you for watching, and see you.
We move on to our next speaker now, who is Mr. Enrique Delamónica. Enrique is a UNICEF Statistics and Monitoring Senior Advisor for Child Poverty and Gender Equality. He has published extensively on economic development, children's rights, socioeconomic disparities, and he's deeply committed to improve the lives of children, adolescents, and their families. So we are really keen to hear about your work, Enrique, and I will just leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camila, for the introduction and for the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to share the screen. I hope that you can hear me well and see the screen when I put up the slides. You let me know. Are they, is it there? Not yet. I hope we don't have the same technical difficulties that Flavia had. I'm really sorry. It was getting quite interesting about the consensus approach. So let me talk a little bit about some of the work we have done and have been doing in UNICEF in terms of measuring child poverty in relation to COVID. Of course, I will say a few words about what we were doing before COVID. I want to try to emphasize as much as possible some of the assumption and the testing that we have done of our Nowcast after the event. And I want to finish with some limitations and suggestions moving forward. So for several years in UNICEF, we have been putting together a data set globally of strictly comparable measures of child poverty. And we look at basically 6 dimensions. And the indicators are the ones you see on the screen: stunting, access to water, sanitation facilities, overcrowding, children attending school or completing primary, depending on the age, and also depending on the age, access to several health services. Now, I want to emphasize something, and it's related to some of the elements that Flavia was mentioning, because this is what we call an opportunistic measure. Opportunistic in the sense that we deal with the dimensions and indicators within those dimensions which are available in household surveys, which were prepared for something else, not to measure poverty. So we do not have the opportunity, as she was trying to explain, to ask people about the things they need and they consider essential in life and whether they have them or they do not have them. So that is one limitation. I'm going to come to that later. But the point is, with that background, that's how we were measuring things before COVID. What about COVID? And one thing that is primordial in this discussion is to recognize that COVID had time-wise a differential effect, or was supposed, or we could hypothesize that it would have a different differential effect on different dimensions, with a very clear short-term impact on education and health, with maybe medium-term impacts on nutrition, and probably longer-term effects on access to sanitation, water, and housing. And although these indicators are different from the indicators in the multidimensional poverty in Mexico that Héctor was discussing in the presentation by him and Fernando, part of the puzzles that they discovered may be related to this differential time lag or time effect of the pandemic. So how did we deal with this? Well, we had to make assumptions. Unfortunately, we had additional information. So for example, we had information on what were the school systems doing to continue educating children in the midst of a lockdown. So the question to measure access to schooling for children during COVID was not, are they going to school or not? Obviously, they were not going to school because of the lockdown, but were they able to continue the schooling based on whatever medium of instruction was used in the country, computers, radio, phone, mobile phones, or television, and whether children had access to them in their household, but also taking into account, and this will come again later, as you will see, the issue of overcrowding. Because if there is one television set, but you have 5 children going to school, and lessons are imparted on TV, well, not every child can access that. So we did factor in the issue of overcrowding. Health was a little bit more complicated because if the child is vaccinated, the child does not become unvaccinated because of COVID. So we have to think of shifting the time of the surveys. We had information in household surveys of children that had or had not been vaccinated by the time they were 12. And what we did was we tried to use that information for children that were too young to have been vaccinated, but were now coming of age at the time of COVID and should be vaccinated or should have been vaccinated. But we didn't have information about whether they were vaccinated or not. So we did a sort of conditional probability based on different characteristics of the child and the child's household to rank children from the most likely to the least likely to be immunized. And also we had information from our country offices from every country on the degree of health service disruption due to both the lockdown on the one hand and the intensity of and the extensiveness of cases of COVID overflowing health facilities. So we were able to play with different thresholds and different probabilities of additional children that would have, which should have been vaccinated, but they were not, or likely not to be vaccinated. Combining these two elements of education and health in the very short term, we estimated, projected, nowcasted about 120, 150 million additional poor children in 2020 compared to pre-COVID numbers. And about 10% of those children were in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also looked at children in monetary poor households, which is a different concept and is measured differently. For questions of time, I'm not going to go through every detail on this slide, but you can look at it while I speak. Basically, the idea is we used national poverty lines because those are the relevant if we want to see what's happening in an individual country. We use the basic stylized fact that poorer families have more children, and we were able to distribute the children into different income deciles based on information from mix and other household surveys. And then what we did was we looked at historical evidence of changes in income distribution, short-term changes in income distribution, mainly associated to crisis like in 2008, 2010, but not only those. We looked at 20, 25 years of historical record. And then we used hypothetical changes in income distribution associated with the predictions of economic growth, or in this case, economic decline, that the World Bank and the IMF were making. Combining these two assumptions, we had a pessimistic, an average, and an optimistic scenario in terms of GDP changes. We looked at, in each of these, more severe or less severe changes in income distribution, and that allowed us to present different scenarios, and each scenario more pessimistic or optimistic with upper and lower bounds. And the nowcast for 20 and 21, which was done in 2020 before we had any information, was an increase in the percentage of children in monetary poor households, and then a decline in 2021. Now, the interesting thing is, now we're in 2024. Now we have some information about things that happened afterwards. How did we do in terms of our assumptions and our results? Well, there was a rebound in GDP. And this is also partly what is shown in Héctor and Fernando's presentation. There seems to be more of a higher impact on households that were already constrained, but even those rebounded. And we have several, not many, post-2021 mixed multiple indicator cluster surveys, which look specifically at children, and we can estimate multidimensional child poverty for them. And there is not an increase when we compare 21 or 22 surveys with pre-2020 surveys, meaning whatever impact the COVID pandemic had on multidimensional poverty kind of passed afterwards. But which does not mean that it was not important. This is something that we have to be very clear. There are a lot of health, for example, on COVID. There are psychological and social impacts of the pandemic, which are very, very important and still affect children today, including maybe some lagging in learning. But in terms of actually measuring poverty, the worst seems to have passed. We also have, and sorry, maybe I should mention that here, we have, in collaboration with the World Bank, analysis of high-frequency phone surveys during and after COVID that we can also use. And when we use those, we can separate households with no children, with few children, just one or two, or with many children. And when we look at them, we can see which of these type of households had a decline in income. As you can see, the major decline is in households with many children. This stays when we control for education level of the parents, urban rural location, etc. And we can do the hypothesis testing, and actually with these sample sizes, 68 and 76% of the households suffered a reduction in income, depending on the household size. They are not different, but they are both different from the reduction, from the percentage of households where there was a reduction in income and had no children. Those are two different worlds. And I think this is important because it validates our assumptions about the distribution of children in the deciles and the poorer children being most affected. We also have information on how the evolution of food security was happening during the pandemic and when there was a peak, but also after the peak, how there was a recovery. Again, all of these pointing towards at least the direction, if not also the order of magnitude of what we had assumed was in the right track. For Latin America specifically, looking at economic growth, yes, there was a huge decline in 2020, but then a recovery in 21. Now, these are not projections. This is really what happened. And what happened is exactly in line with the inputs into our models. Where it's more interesting is when we look at the inputs in our models of income distribution changes, basically measuring the Gini coefficient. And this is the evolution of the Gini coefficient of basically the last 2 decades in Latin America. And this is what we had assumed. And this is what happened. A worsening of income distribution and then a little bit of a recovery. And the important thing here is not only that what we assume is basically what happened, but the order of magnitude. If we look at the order of magnitude of short-term changes in income distribution in the past in Latin America, it's roughly of the same order of magnitude that we were using for our nowcasting. What's interesting, if you look at the two blue circles there, the worsening income distribution, meaning income distribution that is more unequal, in Latin America happened in the period around 2012, 2013, which is not during the 2008-2009 crisis, a period during which income distribution at the global Latin American level actually improved. However, 2 points. First, the change of that improvement and the reversal in 2013 is of the order of magnitude of what we assume. Second point, in our assumptions, when we constructed the model, we did take into account just the change, not the direction. So when we looked at 2008 during the financial crisis, we said, okay, that was the change. This is a reasonable change nowadays. What happens if nowadays, meaning 2020, we assume that change affecting income distribution negatively? So those were the assumptions that we made, the results we had, and the post hoc or ex post validation of the assumptions and some of the results of our Nowcast. What are some of the limitations? As I mentioned, we have an opportunistic measure. We are trying to include more of the type of questions which Flavia was going to tell us about Brazil into our household survey, out into the mix, whether it's in the regular face-to-face round or in a telephone interview afterwards, because we need to get better information and better measures of child deprivation and child poverty, which are based on what people actually tell us are the things that we need, that children need, and not on the things that we say sitting in New York. I didn't talk much about stunting during the presentation, but I mentioned that stunting we treated as probably having a medium-term effect. The reason for that is that the way we incorporated stunting into the measure is stunting for children under 5, and we need the 5 years to see the effect of that. It's very difficult to see effect of stunting in just 6 months. We could see it for wasting, but we were not including pre-COVID wasting in our measure, so we didn't have it. However, in some of the mix and other surveys, we are introducing more and more questions about food diversity and frequency of meals, which are actual inputs for and a better reflection of the right to nutrition, and when they are not there, of deprivation in the right to nutrition. And finally, I want to say that we are satisfied. We think that the nowcastings and the projections we made worked well. I have made a conscious decision at the end of 2021 not to continue doing them. There was no point in doing these projections anymore. But that's when we engage in this analysis of trying to review if things did work well. And for me, one of the most important conclusions is when we do analysis of monetary poverty for the households and then the children therein, and we look at countries where there are no data for a period of years, and we want to input for those years, we basically do that based on income trends, GDP growth or decline. And the same thing when we do it projections into the near future. We should be doing projections into the far future. But we do not include, and I say we, not in UNICEF, but the development community in general, we do not properly take into account changes in income distribution in those models of monetary poverty. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's something that we should collaborate to improve, to get better measures of monetary poverty at the household level. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing, and I'm going to stay with the team so that we can have some questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enrique. That was such a great presentation. So let's just move on. Before we leave time for questions at the end, but now we move on to our final speaker, who is Professor Alberto Minujin, who is a professor at the New School University in New York and the founder and executive director of Equity for Children, an amazing nonprofit organization working to improve the living conditions for deprived children and their families. So thank you so much, Alberto, for joining with your talk, More is Possible, Post-COVID Voice and Participation for Children and Families Living in Poverty. I am going to leave it to you now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that you listen well to me. It's okay. And I will share my presentation. But first, I want to thank really, for me, it's an honor to be with all of you, and really great that you invite me for this. Let me put the presentation. It's okay, you can see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so basically was great to listen the previous presentation and all the work that everyone is doing on trying to measure things. And I'm taking a bit of a different approach that I think that is complementary, in fact. But if I want to try to think about some of the things that the call for this conference was what can be done to mitigate negative impact and harness the opportunities. I will try to talk about opportunities, but taking something that Camila said about amplify the voice of the people living in poverty. I put this title, More is Possible, because I think that we can do more. And it's great to be in this memorial of Peter Townsend. I remember perfectly talking with him about multidimensional child poverty, and many of the things that we were discussing today are done thanks to him and the team, including Dave Gordon. So let me go with the presentation. And there is one, wait. Yes. So I will talk about different things, and I will show something about our experience in equity for children that we had during the pandemic and after the pandemic. But there is one message that I will want to give, and that's why I'm thinking on the title that is More is Possible, is that what we saw, and I will show something now, is that there is enormous amount of energy and creativity about people living in poverty. I think that if sustainable and systemic results are provided, they can be central to accelerate global action and to contribute to reducing poverty. So in this presentation, we focus basically in local action, but I want to be clear that I think that the presence of the government through public social policy is central in all the cases. So that's the main message that I want to give in this presentation, but let me show something, one of the experience that we have during the pandemic. I hope that you can see it. When 2020 started, I remember March of 2020. Now seems far, but it's not so far. And it's great that we are talking about how to modify things and what are the impact. We were working in Equity for Children with the program with different things, and we changed totally what we were doing. And we started series small videos in Latin America of people living with another group that is A Chance in Life, is another organization, international organization. And very simple question of not only what is the situation and what they are doing, but basically what are the solutions that they are finding. So let me show you, it's a few seconds, let me see if this works.
Equidad para la Infancia y A Chance in Life se asociaron para recopilar testimonios de los hogares más afectados por la pandemia del COVID-19 en distintos países de América. Así nació en primera persona.
Mi nombre es Ángela Parra, Lorena Riazo, Marcela Suárez Cortés, María Alejandra Caco Ramírez, señora Marisa Puño Díaz, Lady Villaluz, Mirta Aquino Solero, ella es Mirta Brinquil, yo soy Mirta Brinquil, y acá en el Chafiarito, en el barrio de Oriente.
Sorry. Sorry, 1 second.
Equidad para la Infancia y A Chance in Life se asociaron para recopilar testimonios de los hogares más afectados por la pandemia del COVID-19 en distintos países de América. Así nació en primera persona.
Mi nombre es Ángela Parra, soy nervioso. Marcela Suárez Cortés. María Alejandra Caco Ramírez. Señora Marixia Fuño Díaz. Lady Villalobos. Milta Quino Solero. Ella es Milta Minujin, yo soy Milta Minujin. Y acá en el Chafiarito, en el barrio de Oriente. San Ignacio de Arareco, mi cantón Sumasate. Planes de Zumpango. Mis vecinos también ahorita están pasando momentos difíciles también por esta pandemia que está pasando. De una u otra manera nos afecta a todo el mundo.
Para nosotros es muy importante esto, la salida es colectiva, no es individual.
No se olviden de seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales para ver los videos a medida que los vamos estrenando.
Okay. So what I want to say, what some of the lesson learned from this is all this informal, the importance of the informal networks, one, the importance of the local NGOs, two, including different churches and groups, and how to combine this with general policies in that moment that also suffer a lot. Let's remember that for children, well, Enrique also mentioned that, was one of the, some people say is the most important migration. Millions of children from one day to the other stop going to school and need to study at home. So, but they managed to do things. They managed to have networks that works at local level. And sometimes this complement in a very good way the government policies, and sometimes they not only complement, but they do things that the policies are not ready to do. So with this in mind, I want to show something that we also explore in relation to digital technologies for children. Let me move. So this is data for Argentina, urban areas, and we explore here the use of computers and the use of internet. And one of the effects of the pandemic that we need to have in mind is that the percentage of children that has access, especially to the use of internet, but also use to computer, increase from 19 to 2020. This is data from the household survey, the last semester of 2020. So this is an effect that also I saw that Enrique showed that 73% has access to digital things, that is the internet, but inequality continue to be important. Here is by region. We have here on the top, CAB is the city of Buenos Aires. So here you have in average around 80% of kids, but very near here, that is the greater Buenos Aires, that is to say you have Buenos Aires and you have the surrounding area. You have, and most of the population is there, only in average is 40%. And these inequalities you can see when you look by quintiles. The access to computers goes from 40% in the one on the first quintile to almost 100% on the fifth quintile, and the same happened when you look to number of deprivation. So from no deprivation, 80%, and it moved to near 30%. So that's implied that kids in household living in poverty with problem, this is number of deprivation with some deprivation, and there are many kids, as in some of the videos, I don't have the time to show you, but they talk about this problem. They have 5 kids with 1 computer or thing like that, So the inequality is something that sustains. So given that, I want to show some reflection on that. The first thing that I want to say is that I think that we should empower children and women through voice and participation. That's something that we are talking for a long time, but the lesson, one lesson from the voice and participation is that I think that if we give some more formal way of participating, we can really change and accelerate things. I want to highlight in this situation the value that we look at of small organizations. They are nimble and very agile. They are creative and they can do adjustment and they can adjust to different programs and how the people receive them. So there, I think that we have one important part. The other contribution that I think that's something that can help and is this idea of developing community-based social policy driving social monitoring programs. Now, in Equity for Children, we have several experiences that I can tell about that, but the idea is to create systems that allow and foster community and organization to monitor local social conditions and to collaborate with the local and national government. In some way, this can also be linked to the consensus approach at local level. This is something that we can consider in that sense. This is the other point that I want to bring, and in this case is very much linked to the consensus approach, the idea of merging knowledge. And we talk about this, but this is central on participation. How we can merge that knowledge between academic policy makers and people living in poverty. And it's very much online on the consensus approach. So I can think that we can do a lot, and there is experience that we are working with other people and other organizations on something that we call the University for All, with ATD, All Together in Dignity is the other organization. So basically, what I want to finish is with this idea of top-down, bottom-up. This is nothing new, absolutely nothing new. And we are talking about this for years and years. But I think that now that we have new technology, that especially on communication, we can do a different way of going top-down and bottom-up. I don't want to go much more on that, because I think that this is the main message. And I want to come back to the initial measure, that is, I think that one element that is crucial is to give voice and participation to the people living in poverty and to learn from them. Let me finish with two things. One is, for doing that, is like Daniel Kahneman said, we need to look at the past, that is the situation in COVID, but we need to open our mind to different things of doing things. A bit what we were discussing previously with Enrique mentioned today, and I have hope. That's why I put something that I listened very recently from Mike Jagger, Kay Richard, and the Rolling Stones. So thank you very, very much to all of you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Alberto, and thank you to all the other speakers who have presented their fantastic work today. And I am really sorry that we couldn't hear Flavia, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that we all wanted to hear about the consensus approach. I surely wanted to hear more about it, but I think Flavia has sorted out her audio issues. So I think, Flavia, you can still join the Q&A session now. And if anyone has questions for Flavia, please do write them. So we do have a little bit of time now for a Q&A session. But before we start, let me remind you that please submit your questions through the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. And please do feel free to start asking questions. And please do also say who your question is for, so we can make sure that we're addressing the right panelist. And of course, again, please be respectful with your questions and comments that are all monitored. And finally, as we said before, could you please make sure that you show your name rather than just guess. So I don't think we have any questions yet. At least I cannot see them, if that's correct, Joe. Yes.
Correct.
So
none at the moment.
So I will just start off. I have many questions, but first of all, I would like to ask to all the panelists. Well, I come into the discussion as a social anthropologist, so from an anthropological perspective, rather than someone who does research, specifically on poverty. And I do research I've done research for the past 15 years with communities that live quite deep in the Amazon rainforest and who have for decades, centuries, we're not sure how long, but for a long time, lived as hunter-gatherers in the forest. And so my question is, when you work with a population such as, a group of hunter-gatherers, forest dwellers, many of what seem to be the kind of measurements of what we call poverty don't quite apply. So for example, Enrique, when you were talking about how do we define poverty, through, for example, how many children attend school? Well, forest dwelling societies, not only they didn't have formal schooling until very recently, but they had a completely different way of learning. And the real wealth there was all the knowledge that was orally communicated. And so the paradox is that when school is brought in, it's not that people become better off. They're actually losing this really precious wealth that is the oral knowledge that then there's no time to learn in school. At the same time, having many children meant, again, having a form of wealth, because the kids help, the kids start fishing when they are, or hunting when they're 6 years old. And so if you have a lot of children, they help out with family stuff. So my question is, let's see if I can formulate it properly. But my question is, how can we define, because you're experts on this, I'm not. So how do we agree on definitions of poverty that can make sure that we allow for multiple models of development, that can make sure that, then tackling poverty doesn't mean that we all go down the same path of kind of capitalistic, neoliberal economic development? So it's a big question. I don't know if any of you would like to.
I'm happy to start answering, but I don't know if you want to put together some other questions or other comments.
Maybe I think that is a very good question. Let's talk a bit about that, because it's part of what I was trying to say. Is I think that when we do a survey, it's an average of things. So it's difficult to put more in the local context. That's why I'm suggesting that maybe something like this idea of local monitoring and that kind of things can help on doing a sort of consensus approach in average, and after that moving to something more local. But because the situation on the Amazon must be totally different from the urban situation in, I don't know, in Rio. So, sorry.
Sure. So the good thing, and the organizers, please correct me if I am wrong. I think the good thing is that we have 2 weeks to discuss this issue, because it's a really, really difficult issue with philosophical roots into discussions of universality, of human rights, cultural relativism, and of course it relates to measurement issues, how household surveys are conducted. So there are many levels, and I would be happy to touch on at least some of those, but as I said, we probably need 2 weeks of discussion and 2 years to write a couple of dissertations on this point. I see Dave has his hand up, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
I was just going to respond to Camilla's very interesting question. Most of my colleagues are working social science. We have used consensual methods to try and estimate poverty at national or regional level, but our colleagues in environmental science have used the same methodology with focus groups in very small local communities, fisher folk in Madagascar, some rural forest dwelling communities in India. And so strangely enough, it's not the social scientists who've been working on these small communities with very different cultures and very different economies. It's been environmental scientists who've been looking at the effects of climate change, environmental change on these particularly vulnerable communities. So the methodology it can be used at either a national scale or at a much more local scale with subgroups within the national system.
So if I can follow up on that, your question, Camila, also allows me to say two things that, for reasons of time, I didn't quite emphasize. One, as you will see in the papers that I posted, we have more information on the results, but also the assumptions of what I presented. A lot of that work was done in collaboration with Save the Children, which I didn't acknowledge properly at the beginning, so I want to do that. The second thing is the issue of definition. How do we define child poverty? So if you allow me, I will start a little bit with that, because I think it will help. What I showed in my slide was the actual practice on how we measure globally in a way that is consistent, meaning the same dimensions, the same indicators, the same thresholds across countries in order to have a comparative base and a global number. However, that being said, 2 points. One, that's not the definition. That's just how we operationalize the definition for that particular purpose. Our advice when we go to countries is do it differently. Do it, as Dave and Alberto was saying, asking people what they need in the country, in the context. Second point, when we say that we have a definition based on child rights, which is what we do in UNICEF. So our definition is children are poor when we look at certain rights and those rights are not fulfilled. And the question is, why certain rights? And this does not come from UNICEF, this comes from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. In their approach to human rights and poverty, they say there are some rights, a subset of all the rights, the fulfillment of which require directly and fundamentally and consistently material resources to be fulfilled. 2 examples. Right to nutrition, you need to eat food. That's a thing you need to have to fulfill the right to nutrition. The right to privacy means the government should not read your correspondence. It has nothing to do with being poor or not poor or material deprivation. So that's the first distinction. So when we tell countries, look, these are the rights that constitute poverty, these are the child rights in the Convention of the Rights of the Child that require directly, consistently, and fundamentally material resources to be fulfilled, but those material resources are going to be different across country contexts and across cultures, and even subnationally, like Dave was saying. However, so I think on that we're all agreeing, and it's easy, and we can do that. We can do, as Dave said, use the socially perceived needs in different subgroups of the country. I am very fond of an exercise that was not by my colleagues, but colleagues of Dave in Uganda, when they compare the national poverty and refugee children, children living in refugee camps or host communities. We can do that. And it's interesting, the consistency in the elements that they consider as the minimum they need. But for some of the deep forest communities, you mentioned Brazil, but it could be the same thing in DRC or some parts of Malaysia. It's not just in Latin America that this issue happens. We have two problems: a simple problem and a big headache. The simple problem is we might not even have the capacity to properly sample those children because we don't have a proper census. We don't know exactly how to take random samples of these children that might even be not living in a household the way the household is defined in order to do a household survey. So that's already a challenge. But there are ways to surmount those. The biggest challenge is the recognition, and I think that's the core of your question. The recognition that they might have a completely different lifestyle, a completely different value system. So one way we could do is ask them, what's the minimum education your child should have? And they might say, well, like you said, by age 12, they should be able to learn to fish on their own, because that is what's going to allow them to survive in its context, which is fine, and we can do that, and we should do that. The conflict comes with the universality of rights, because there are things that a lot of us consider are universal rights, and we think that every child should be able to learn to read and write and sum and multiply and take percentages, and that might not be what is taught in those communities. So this gets us into the conflict. Is it okay not for these communities to learn these things? Should we prevent them from learning these things? Should we push them to learn these things even if they don't want to? I mean, these are fundamental issues of the conflict between cultural relativism and human rights, which, at least in my own experience in Latin America, whenever communities are exposed to these so-called modern improvements, they embrace them. They do. They don't want their children to die before age 5 if they can be immunized. It might not be, part of their original culture, but if there are ways, and the ways are explained, they're incorporated in culturally appropriate ways, communities would love to be able to connect with cell phones with their relatives that migrated to the city, for example, if they could, if it's done in a culturally appropriate way. So I think it's a fundamental question. I hope you have a lot of your students working on this, because a lot of dissertations can be written.
Thank you, Enrique, and everyone. Yes, it's a really interesting, it's such an interesting debate. And just to follow up with this super quickly with this, with the problem I see is you're completely right. These communities, if you come in, we bring in, I don't know, some like medicines and certain kind of vaccines and resources, let's say, sort of Western technological resources, let's call it. Obviously, they're very welcome. The problem I see, and that then a lot of the young people and some young anthropologists, indigenous anthropologists I'm working with, the problem that is that very often these technologies and resources are seen as one, a kind of just one way towards development. So it's either this or the elders' knowledge of natural medicinal plants. There's no way in between. And perhaps I think, like Alberto was saying, maybe including, working, and like you were saying, Enrique, as well, working with local people directly, engaging them directly in the research will lead us to find new pathways toward development that will not mean one or the other, but that will mean finding a way in between, I guess. But yeah, it's really such an interesting answers that you're giving us. So we have some questions now. The first one is from Patricio Oliveira. Buenas tardes. Patricio is writing from Chile. Thank you so much for joining us from Chile, Patricio. And Patricio has a question for Alberto. And he's saying one interesting thing that comes from Héctor and Enrique's presentations is about the distribution effects on poverty. And so Patricio is asking, in those voices, so I'm not sure, Patricia, I understand your question, but you're saying in those voices of the people that Alberto was referring to, there's something, if you can say something, Alberto, about poverty, inequality, and the distribution effects on poverty in the research that you've been conducting.
Well, thank you for the question. And let me tell you that we work on this was not I showed two things. One was the thing of computers, that is more average data on how Enrique said, consumption, no, well, doesn't matter. But the video that I was showing that we did in all Latin America was in areas of people living in poverty. So really the effort in that moment was to bring the voice of those people and to do advocacy with that and to learn about how they are doing. And that's we were trying to show in different areas. We showed that in several UN meetings, but also at local level was showing to the government and to discuss the policy that they are doing. So that's basically the impact. And that's why I was learning in that moment. That's the basic thing. I was learning from them, what they do and how they do. I think that there is a lot of things that we can do in that relation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto. Yes, I think what you were saying about including, really developing a kind of research that takes as a starting point the experiences of people that, and especially, children and underprivileged children that have been so, routinely excluded from these wider debates is really crucial. But yeah, so we move on to the next question now, which is for Enrique. Murray is asking, Enrique, your integration of inequality into nowcasting of poverty is so important in trying to ascertain especially vulnerable pockets, and you showed this. So what are the priority ways forward in maximizing the usefulness of this link in such modeling by pushing into the actual mechanisms of inclusions and exclusion, the link positioning in the income distribution and depth of the severity of poverty?
Thank you, Mary, for the question. Very, very good question. And thank you for the compliment too. I think there is something that comes from the traditional economic thinking. And the traditional economic thinking is more income, less poverty. And we know that's a myth. It doesn't happen like that. So the first task is to keep on engaging with economists that work on these issues, to remind them of this, and to show that it is possible, that we have data sources. The ones we use is from the UN Wider, the UN University Wider Institute in Helsinki. Huge database. Even the World Bank has a huge database on income distribution. They are just not used to including that because sometimes they don't even know how to do it. They say, oh, sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up. Well, precisely. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. That's what we need to include it. So keep the dialogue, keep on pushing, commenting when they write something, inviting them to write things together. That's what we are trying to do. The other one is to try to avoid the fixation that a lot of economists, journalists, I would also include in this group, and a lot of colleagues, for example, at the World Bank, to equate poverty with what used to be called $1 a day, and now it's $1 purchasing power parity of $2.15. Because that is not poverty. That's, you know, whatever it is, it's not poverty. So now the thing is, that only gives you how many people are poor. But if we want to get into the issues that you mentioned, Murray, of income distribution, of the depth of poverty, of the severity of poverty, then we need to go beyond that and explore those. And the good thing is, and I think I can say without bragging about it, is that the World Bank is moving away from that measure. And I can do it without bragging because it has nothing to do with the efforts of 20 years of different academic colleagues and UNICEF to tell the World Bank that measure is wrong. They're moving away from it because they realize it's wrong, because they are running out of poor people. So they need to reimagine who their target population is. So now they're moving lines, inventing new lines, inventing new things. So it's in that discussion, it's in that debate that we have to say, look, there is more to this analysis of poverty than a fixed poverty line. We need to look at the head count, we need to look at depth and severity. And by the way, and with this I close, I'm sorry, I don't want to make this too long, to do the same thing with multidimensional poverty. Because in multidimensional poverty, we are so used to just, because that's what we want. That's what the journalist wants. That's what our communication colleagues want. How many children are poor? And has poverty increased or declined? Well, maybe poverty did not decline, but the number of deprivations suffered by different groups of children, including the most excluded, which could be an ethnic minority, could be rural or deep in the forest, as we were discussing. Their situation could have increased a lot if they went from having an average of 5 deprivations to just 1 or 2 deprivations, quote unquote, just 1 or 2 deprivations. And we seldom pay attention to that, and we should. And sorry, another final point, we do more because that's what we control, the multidimensional measures. We do the disaggregation subnationally. Urban, rural, gender, administrative units. We are trying very hard now to go even to admin level 2 and lower, using machine learning, satellite images, so that we can really get into the pockets of exclusion. And that is also part of the work moving forward. Over.
Thank you, Enrique. Can I just check, Flavia, would you like to add anything? I think if your mic is working now, and maybe if you have any comments or you want to answer any of the questions. No, it's not possible. Okay, no, it's okay, Flavia. We'll share your presentation. And yes, so just following up from this, because we still have, we don't have questions at the moment, so but we still have a little bit of time. So I'm going to just jump in and ask another one. Following on from what we just discussed, something I was thinking about is also, again, still in terms of how do we measure poverty? Where's the line? Where's the amount of dollars? And what I was wondering is about the perception of poverty from people who are, directly dealing with it. Because, for example, I've worked in Latin American communities for nearly 20 years now. And something I have seen is that I was working with communities that didn't have running water 20 years ago, and they still don't have running water now. However, every single person in that community, or at least every single person below 40 years of age, owns a smartphone. And if you ask the young people I work with, what makes you wealthier, running water or a smart, like what's more necessary, running water or a smartphone? There is no doubt it's the smartphone. The smartphone is something of absolute basic necessity you cannot live without, even in parts of the forest where there's no Wi-Fi, no internet connection, but you need a smartphone. There's no way. And for me, I will consider that, that's not such a necessary object, but it's because I can very easily have one. And actually, if we take young people's perspective in these communities, that the smartphone is vital, is necessary to everyday life. So again, how do we make sense of that from your expert point of view, and how do we integrate that into a, again, economic model of development that can be just for everyone?
Do you have a particular target for that question? Is it Alberto, me, Dave?
It's open for all of you.
Okay. Dave has his hand up. I have a couple of comments, but happy to wait.
It's a fascinating question. So 25 years ago, when we were first doing our work for UNICEF on using opportunity measures with what was available to measure severe child poverty in a multidimensional way, one of the parts of the definition that we operationalized was getting information for children, having access to radios, televisions, computers, and when eventually the internet. And when we went to different countries and explained the measure, if we went to the poorest countries in Africa or Asia, everyone there said, oh yes, information, that's really important for children. It's what we need for the future. When we showed the same idea about including information in rich countries like the UK or Europe, everyone said, no, that's not important. Well, you need to look at sanitation and vaccination and healthcare in more detail. Take the information out. So there was a complete mismatch between the level of importance that having access to information about the world was seen as in the poorest countries compared to the richest countries. I guess it's because we take it for granted in the UK, whereas in other parts of the world it can't be taken for granted.
That's really interesting, David. Thank you. Will anybody else want to say something, Alberto, Enrique?
Yeah, I want to continue what Dave is saying, because it's true. Information was one of the big points, complicated to measure, as we know, but for us was very important to put there. But there were these contradictions that they said, no, immunization, education, well, what level of education? And what about quality of education? So I want to say that there is some dimensions that are very difficult to measure and to consider, because these are material deprivation. It's all the other things that are non-material deprivation linked with discrimination, inequality, for example, all the issues related with gender inequality. But the thing that you are saying about the kids in some areas in the Amazon, so there is then sort of discrimination or not discrimination. How to include the people, how to put that kind of things is something that we are also concerned, and well, we can talk about that, and Dave also and Enrique mentioned, but I want to mention that I think that is an important dimension on this debate.
Yeah. So if I can say, I'm going to rely on your good memory, because as I'm assuming everybody memorized the slides I showed on slide number 3, when I presented the elements we use globally to measure poverty in a way that's comparable, we did not include information. And it's partly for the reasons mentioned by Dave and Alberto. It's very hard to establish that minimum in a way that it's reasonable across the whole world. I always give myself as an example. I do not own a television. I do not own a radio. Does it mean I'm deprived of information, or the object that will allow me to access information? Of course not. I have my phone, right? So I agree with your the persons that you have met in Latin America. It is essential. It is a very important thing to have. There is an issue, though, a little wrinkle there. For some of them, it may be conspicuous consumption. It may be the thing that everybody should have just to show that they have it, which is a twist that we have to take into account when we look at this issue. But having the means, whether it's a phone, a television, or something, to be able to access information, we think it's a fundamental human right and a child right. But what about comparing it with water? What I would venture, and it's a question for you, and maybe you can confirm or disagree, is that even if they do not have running water, they have some minimum level at which they manage to get water. They have some access to water. It might not be ideal. It might be not, a pipe into the house, into the kitchen, and 2 different bathrooms. But they might have maybe a pump outside or some other way. And that's why when we do the measure for all of the dimensions, we have a gradient. So there is extreme, and there is severe, and there is moderate and mild deprivation. And maybe some people will say, look, as long as I satisfy minimally my water, it might not be the best kind of water, but I have some, then I really need the other aspects of life too, because although humans are animals and we need to eat and sleep, we also need to socialize and we need to learn, and that's where the information comes in. So what was the situation in terms of water in those communities you visited?
Well, in the communities I work with, the water is, in the past maybe 5 years, they built some kind of wells, but mainly the water is the river water. And the river, it's a water that, for example, I cannot drink. I drank it a couple of times and it was not good for my body. So I need to bring, to take a water filter with me. It's remote. It's remote. Yeah. But what I also see that's very interesting in this sense, and actually before today, I hadn't quite thought about this in these terms, but well, my work is mainly about children and young people, and what I've always seen is the huge intergenerational difference that there is there. And having the same lifestyle, so the people in the community have the same lifestyle, all the generations, of course, they eat in the same way, obviously. However, there's a big difference I think, in how different generations consider themselves to be poor or not. So what I saw from the very start is that older people that grew up in the forest, having no contact with the outside at all, they feel rewarded having that life, even if, like you say, the water could be better, and if they had electricity, it would be preferable probably, but still living in the forest is what is rewarding. They want to be there. If they go to the city, they hate it after 2 days. But the young people, the children, they are the ones who feel really poor there, because not being able to watch television is not good. That's not a good life if you don't have a television. And not having a phone, that really makes you a different kind of human being. You are not you're not really part of society if you don't have a smartphone. So again, the same lifestyle is extremely rewarding for some generations and really not good enough for the young people. And I've seen them leaving en masse from the forest and going to the city where they really are poor. They live in slums. They don't have money. They tell me, when I first moved here, I couldn't sleep at night because I was so hungry. I was just lying on my bed feeling hungry. I couldn't sleep due to hunger. But still, they can walk around at night because there's electric light, and they can, very slowly buy a smartphone, and they can wear a T-shirt that they bought in the market, and that's preferable.
Yeah, well, in a way, I'm not surprised. Dave has more experience than me on this, but when the questions about what are the minimum that everybody should have are asked of adults and of children, not just in the communities, as you mentioned, but in European countries, there is a huge difference in what the adults think is the minimum that children should have and what the children think is the minimum that they should have. The items are different. So in a way, I am not surprised of that.
Alberto, did you want to add something?
No, only that I think that is important what you are saying and what Enrique is saying, because the needs from the children, when you work with children and you ask things to the children, what are the things? That's why I mentioned non-material deprivation, because certain things that we are not measuring for them being discriminated and at very early age, that has a big impact in their life. Yeah, the bullying at the school, the certain things that has a big, I'm not talking about I don't have experience with the Amazon, but I'm talking about urban areas and semi-urban areas. So that's why I bring this thing that I think that is part of what you are saying, because also they have now connection. They can see the other thing. That the other point that I was saying about the top-down, bottom-up, we have new technology. We can do other things, and in fact, they are experienced of how to distribute wealth or things like that. Okay, so that's basically what I want to say.
Thank you, Alberto. And I think David also has a comment.
I was just going to add the very first talk we had at 8 o'clock in the morning, UK time, from Dr. Maggie Lau in Hong Kong. She compared the perception of what was needed by parents and by their children. And in Hong Kong, all items the parents, more parents said were needed than the children did, but the big differences were in things like extra lessons so they could do better at school, where the parents were much keener than the children. In the UK research, there's not such a clear pattern of difference, but the difference is that the children tend to think that their material needs are not as important as their parents do, but their social needs, particularly having things to fit in with their classmates at school and with their peers, their social needs, the children weight much more highly than their parents do. So parents tend to weight up material needs in Europe, and the children tend to weight up, more children think their social needs are important, whereas in other parts of the world it does vary, and it does vary by the age group of the children as well.
And,
Yes.
and another one, sorry, Camille, if I may, which I think you might also appreciate, when we were doing this work in Africa, one of the rights that constitute poverty is the right to play, because you need objects to play. But then a lot of the colleagues in Africa were saying, no, you don't need an object to play. You can just run, jump, sing, climb a tree. You don't need an object. So is that a market-based, capitalist-based approach to thinking how we realize this right or not? In Europe, it is measured. You know, one of the indicators of material deprivation for children is not having toys. But then how can we think of the objects that children play with? Because even in a rural community, they might have toys. They might not buy them at the supermarket, but they have different kinds of toys. And also related to what you were saying, when people migrate from rural areas to the cities, the children know that there are other children that have toys. Even if they can have a lot of fun jumping up and around, they know that other children that play with other things that they don't have, and they suffer that. And that is part of this relational understanding of poverty. Poverty is not just not having things. It's not having things, as Dave said, in the social milieu in which they live and grow up.
Let me say a brief thing, because we are working on something that is public space, children's and families and intergenerational relation. That is public space is not only because people say, well, do in a park. but the streets are public space. So how people use the street in the neighborhood, in this, in the other, how the kids to play around, and that make huge difference. So that's another aspect that we need to look at.
Thank you so much. These are such an interesting conversation, and I will keep going for hours. But I'm afraid that we are running out of time now. We are just at the end of our session. But this was such a great session, really. So thank you so much to all our wonderful speakers for their amazing presentations. And thank you to everyone, to all the participants for joining, for engaging in the discussion. And I would just like to remind you that this event has been recorded and it will be available on the BPI website very soon, where you can watch it and you can share the links. Please share the link with friends, with colleagues who may be interested. And if you can please also engage with our online discussions on your Twitter account. So you will find us at Bristol Poverty, and there's a conference hashtag as well, which is hashtag BPI 2024. So what from my co-chair, Joe, is there anything else we should add?
I think we're done. So thank you very much, Camilla.
Thank you for inviting me to chair this session. I have really absolutely enjoyed this, and I look forward to reading more of the work from all the speakers, which really this was fantastic. So thank you very, very much, and thank you to Bristol Poverty Institute for organizing such a fantastic event and making it hybrid. And yes.
Thank you very much, Camila, Joe, Dave, and great to be with friends and colleagues. Great conversation.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers and thanks to the BPI team. We appreciate them in the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Bye, everyone.
Have a good evening, everyone, or morning, wherever you are. Or middle of the night for some of you. Bye.
See you next time.